about is a series of tweets which occurred between the 21st and 24th of September 2013 during the Westgate shopping mall terrorist attack. And some of the things I'll be saying will actually link quite closely to what Professor Rudner was saying in terms of why extremists want to use the internet, and especially activities in Twitter and social media and using publicity and propaganda techniques. So I'm David Mair. I'm a postgraduate research student here at Swansea University. I'm a member of the Cyber Terrorism Project, and this is my case. So there we go. Yep. The Westgate mall terrorist attack occurred during the 21st, 24th of September. There were several shooters. We think there were somewhere between 4 and 15. Different studies come up with different numbers. Some studies believe that all of the individuals involved were killed in the attack. Some studies believe they all left unscathed. There's a lot of confusion. What we do know is that 67 people died, including 4 suspected attackers, and 175 were wounded. Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the attack, but interestingly, several Twitter accounts claiming to be linked directly to al-Shabaab surfaced throughout the attack and started tweeting from an al-Shabaab viewpoint. They used this in order for a number of reasons to justify their attacks, to engage in publicity and propaganda, to try and recruit others, and to engage in anti-Western rhetorics. So if we talk about the aims of the study, the aim was to undertake a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the tweets that we collected in terms of the content that they provided. So things such as what makes up the tweets. Do they have any external links? Do they tag others? Do they tweet at others? Do they engage in conversations? Is there any image usage? Is the tweet threatening or innocuous? What was the core aim of the tweet? The motivation of the tweets, so things such as the objective. Was it about publicity and propaganda? Was it about psychological warfare? Was it about recruitment and radicalization? And also the motivation of the tweet itself. So did the tweet itself justify the attack? Did the tweet itself give contempt towards the response? Did it engage in anti-West rhetoric? Or did it involve some other kind of communication strategy? And we also look at the intended audience. So who was the tweet intended for? There are different actors involved in reading these tweets. So was it directed towards the general population who had been victims of this attack? Was it directed towards terrorist sympathizers? Was it directed towards members of the government, the West, or even the media? So this is how we decided to look at these tweets in order to analyze them and assess them. And then we put them all into SPSS and we ran it. So of the tweets, there are 267 of them, and they were sent from 7 different Twitter accounts, and all of the tweets we got were from the primary source. So during the attack, while the Westgate terrorist attack was occurring, we were on Twitter trying to get as many of these tweets as possible, and we ended up with 265, which looks somewhere like this from the 7 attacks. You'll notice that the vast majority of attacks come from the first 2 accounts. And this is because Twitter began shutting down the accounts and deleting them as soon as they surfaced. So you'll notice that this one here only has 1 tweet available. And this is because Twitter became quite adept at identifying the accounts and shutting them down. So it was a bit of a race for time for us to identify the accounts and use them before they went on. That leads us to this question: how do we know that al-Shabaab were actually behind the accounts? How do we know that it wasn't just someone claiming to be from al-Shabaab? And there's a couple of reasons. We don't actually know it was al-Shabaab. The account hasn't been verified, but there's some evidence for it. The first is that all Twitter accounts include the handle HSM Press Office, or HSM Publicity, or HSM something. HMS actually stands for Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, which is the full name attributed to al-Shabaab. It was the first account which we identified was actually launched in December 2011 and had been publicising al-Shabaab content for 2 years before the point of the Westgate shopping attack, and been the subject of several blogs and studies beforehand. 97% of the tweets were delivered in English, which might seem to be strange, because al-Shabaab is not a primarily English-speaking terrorist organisation. However, al-Shabaab has had experience in the past of recruiting English-speaking foreign fighters. For instance, Omar Hamimi, the American, was attributed to al-Shabaab, and he engaged in a lot of Twitter-like activity and had essentially ran the al-Shabaab publicity and propaganda department for quite some time before he was murdered by his ex-colleagues. And also Western citizens were linked to the Westgate attacks, so there was talk of Americans being involved. The UK terrorist affiliate Samantha Leftweight was thought to be involved at one point, and a Norwegian citizen was actually involved. The Norwegians sent a party over to Nairobi to engage in the investigation because of one of their citizens' involvement in the terrorist attack. The third reason we think this is affiliated to al-Shabaab is because the content included such detail relevant to al-Shabaab's ideology, history, politics, and their use of force. They were very sympathetic to al-Shabaab's cause. So the concession would be, if it's not al-Shabaab, then it's a very adept sympathizer who is very keen to engage with the ideology of al-Shabaab and push that forward. So if it's not legitimate, it certainly has the appearance of legitimacy, which is important in terms of engaging in publicity and propaganda. It might not be the account itself, but it certainly does the job for it. There are some limitations to the study, obviously. First one being that we might not have all the tweets. At the time, hashtag Westgate was trending worldwide, and filtering all the sound from the noise was a very difficult task, trying to identify terrorist groups using al-Shabaab throughout the hundreds of thousands of people using hashtag Westgate for the actual purposes of the hashtag to raise support and sympathy was quite difficult. Secondly, that Twitter began deleting accounts, so as soon as we found an account, we had to get as many tweets as we possibly could before the tweets were destroyed. So we might not have all of them, and there might not be any way to get all of them. However, we have plans to go and do a secondary analysis of second-hand tweets. Rather than have the primary tweets from the accounts itself, we'll go to blogs, newspapers, places like that, which will list tweets as they appeared. Second is that only one set of analysis has been occurred. These are very much initial findings, which I have done at this point in time. We hope to go and do further analysis and verify what I found here. The third is that there's a language barrier in place. While 97% of tweets were in English, Arabic was used for about 8 tweets, and there was a mixture of English and another language, which is yet to be identified in some of the tweets as well. So 3% of our tweets we haven't been able to code at this point. So if we actually go on to now assessing the tweets and seeing what people were saying, we're going to assess the content in terms of external links and interaction. And it's actually really, really similar. So in all the tweets, only 7 contained a link, and only 7 contained a reference to other people. Now these are actually different tweets. They're not the same ones that linked and tweeted at people. So there was really no attempt to provide people with links to other websites, and there's really no attempt to engage with discussion or any form of interaction with other people whatsoever. It was very much just a stream of consciousness in terms of this is our view and this is all we're going to say in the matter. So if we look at examples of external links, the first one is from a sheikh who produced a speech regarding the Westgate attacks, praising them for their efforts. An English language version was produced and they linked to that. And the second one was a newspaper article in which al-Shabaab talked about how they had let women and children out. They'd given them free passage before they engaged in their terrorist attack, which produces a form of sympathy and a form of honour among their testimony there. So they linked to that as well. In terms of references, in this top tweet, they engaged with someone who had purported to be a journalist. They wished to engage with that person to try and get what journalist group they were from, which involved some form of investigation to look at the credentials of this journalist to see if they're going to be sympathetic or not towards them. And the second one was quite tongue-in-cheek, actually. They were discussing, can everyone see at the back what these say? Good, that's absolutely fine. It was a very tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic response in terms of Twitter was blocking their accounts, so they then turned around and said well, can you block the leader of the Kenyan government? That's who Kenyatta is. Can you block him because he's being abusive to us? So the Twitter main goal is not to actually be a springboard or an advertisement to any al-Shabaab website. It is indeed, in fact, just to keep the audience on the Twitter feed. They don't want people leaving. They want people to stay there where they have control of all the narrative and they can establish dominance. And again, little attention is given to interacting with other people as well. They have no desire to get involved in discussions. And I would say that there's two reasons for that. The first is an attempt to establish and control the narrative over the facts of the matter, to discuss what's going on and not link out to other websites. And secondly is not to bore the audience or have them accept any other form of ideology. If they began tweeting at people who were sympathetic, they would be seen as callous and cruel perhaps. And if they began tweeting at people who were sympathetic to the Westgate terrorist attack, they could be bored by the details of back and forth. There's a need, in fact, to retain the population of the tweets and a desire to be in charge of the content. So if they link out to al-Shabaab websites, for instance, they longer have control of the content. We have to remember that al-Shabaab websites can be quite extreme in their content. So linking out to them might not be the best strategic move for al-Shabaab in terms of doing that. So if we move on towards images and threats, it's very much the same in terms of image content. In fact, it's even less. So they only tweeted 2 images throughout the entire attack. In fact, the vast majority of it was just text-based language. And they also, the majority of messages were innocuous, with only around 30% of their tweets being threatening in some way, either directly threatening or indirectly, with an assumed threat behind it. And again, the 3% of tweets missing, those are the Arabic tweets which we weren't able to code. So if I give examples of these tweets, the innocuous tweet is discussing how it's a justification. Westgate is born out of injustice. You've been unjust to us, we'll be unjust to you. There's no real threat behind that, it's just a statement of fact. The direct threat is discussing a new attack which is going to occur, a new threat, a new plot. So it's a psychological warfare tactic, something that's saying we're going to attack again, there's something that's about to happen. The indirect threat is discussing that there is a threat in place in which the hostages are strapped up with bombs, and if they attempt to interfere with these bombs anyway, then more people will die. So it's not explicitly stating that they're going to kill people, but that people might die if there's any intervention. So there's very few images used throughout the entire Twitter campaign, and this is actually contrary to academic thought on this matter. Images are generally thought to be central to terrorists' content and productions, and this doesn't seem to be the case here. And there's a couple of reasons for that, perhaps. The first maybe is might not be any access to images. The attack happened at a shopping mall. There was no access on the terrorist point, perhaps, to CCTV, and they had to rely on media images that were released. But they didn't do that. They didn't rely on these media images. And that might be tied into the second point, because the majority of tweets were innocuous in nature, and there was a very small attempt to terrorize the audience and engage in threats. So the tone of tweets are generally civil in nature. They're very matter of fact. There's not much in the way of getting people's backs up. It's just very much justification for what's been happening and framing things in a very sort of civil and sympathetic way. The reason I think that there weren't any images engaged was because the images would like to be very graphic. This wasn't an event like 9/11 or 7/7 where bombs were used and you get those spectacular images of flames and fire and husks that are left over afterwards. It's executions. You have lots of dead bodies. You have blood. There are body parts from the bombs that were strapped onto individuals. So the images are likely to be very graphic. And this is going to turn people off. So when you have a Twitter feed in which you're trying to retain popularity and you're trying to retain the publicity of that, these images might actually be counterproductive to that. So it doesn't seem that they used them for that reason. They didn't want to put up images of murdered individuals because that would detract from what they're actually trying to say here. And again, with the threats, it might have the same effect. If you're continually putting threats out against the population, they're not going to want to engage with that. They're going to stay away. They're going to do other things instead. And in fact, if you overuse threats, it may result in a lack of credibility when those threats don't happen. So we go by number of tweets by objective. In terms of what we have going on here, the vast majority were publicity and propaganda. That was their key goal, and psychological warfare was their second goal, which accounts for roughly a third of the overall tweets. It's important to note that tweets could have more than one category and more than one motivation, so this will sum up to more than 265. If we engage with what these tweets are actually saying, you have various different examples here of what each one comprehended. This online training one is likely to be quite controversial. It could be more of a publicity and propaganda one, but I believe that in terms of online trading, indoctrination of belief system is as important to terrorist groups as is learning how to fire weapons and learning how to engage in terrorist attacks. The indoctrination of and justification of what you're doing is just as important a training tool in that as others. So I'm going to move on quickly to by motivation. So here are different motivations going from furthering ideology all the way along to the invitation to direct contact. And what's key to note here is that the anti-West rhetoric and the invitation to direct contact is actually quite limited. There's not that which you would expect. Al-Shabaab claims to be a religious organization which is against the West, which is against the Western civilization there, but really they're engaging in the immediacy of their effect. They're furthering the ideology, they're justifying their attacks, they're showing contempt for the response, and they're threatening future attacks. It's all about what's happening right there and right now. And again, a few tweets there in terms of what's happened, and here for the ideology because it's against the West and Christian individuals because there's anti-West rhetoric and invitation to direct contact. So again, main reasons for publicity and propaganda, although psychological warfare is important to them as well. There's very little way engaging in anti-West rhetoric or expressing any interest for individuals to engage in direct contact. It's not about engaging with journalists, it's not about recruitment and radicalization, it's not about getting financial backers, it's about justifying what they're doing and furthering the ideology. There were 3 tweets which related to command and control, one of which discussed attacks going to their next base. So yes, I realise I only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm rushing through, and I apologise for that. I will be happy to answer questions. In terms of audience, the vast majority of tweets were directed to the general population and then terrorist sympathisers. And then again, government. So again, the West and the media, okay, for a very small percentage, a very small part of who the tweets were actually directed at. In fact, the audience is very much territorial based. The general population are people who were living in Nairobi and in Kenya at the time. Terrorist sympathisers are likely to be linked to Somalia in some way, likely to be linked to al-Shabaab. The government is obviously based in Kenya. So the West and the media, who are likely based outside, have really had no sort of direction here in these in the tweets that were directed at them. And what that shows us is that al-Shabaab it's quite, sorry, I've lost my place. Yeah, so it poses as an extreme group which is ideologically opposed to the West and violently resolved to terrorizing it. But the data here doesn't seem to support that. They are in fact very much politically motivated with territorial goals in place. They are regionally structured and geographically based in nature. And again, they seem to have no interaction with the media. So that might show a reluctance to give up their indication. They don't want to give up the control of the narrative to a potentially unsympathetic organisation. They want to keep control of that narrative. They want to follow that through. They have no interest in giving the media the information that they need to publicise against them. Oop. So in conclusion, al-Shabaab was very retained control over the narrative of their attacks. They didn't give out any links. They didn't involve others in the discussion. They didn't link to other people's viewpoints. And they didn't share any images. They had no desire to give out any form of narrative loss there. In order to retain their analysis, they adopted an innocuous tone overall, and in order to shy away from presenting any of these spectacular images which you normally see in terrorist attacks. In fact, all the accounts shared a similar level of innocuity. The threatening content didn't really aggrandize over time. And lastly, terrorism is essentially violent politics. It's not a global entity, but it's in fact a local group with local objectives and local goals, and that's what they're working towards. And certainly in terms of tweets that are sent out during an attack, during an ongoing operation, are very much linked to those operational, geographical, regional, political goals. Thank you for listening. No questions because they'll be at the end, but thank you very much for your time.